The hospital lobby was unnervingly still for a Tuesday morning. The usual rhythm of carts rolling across tiles, nurses hustling between departments, and low chatter from the waiting area had fallen into a hushed tension. Something had happened. Everyone could feel it, the subtle ripple that passed through the air when someone important was in danger. Dr. Elijah Reed stepped out of the elevator with his tablet in hand and headphones still looped around his neck from the ride in. He wore charcoal slacks, clean white sneakers, and a fitted jacket instead of the traditional white coat. It wasn't a protest. It was a habit born from years of watching respect only arrive when the coat did. If they couldn't recognize him without it, the coat wouldn't help. He moved fast, but not rushed. His eyes scanned the hallway, noting subtle things most missed: a nurse hesitating too long at a medication cart, a security guard tapping his earpiece while watching an internal feed, a janitor frozen mid-mop near the executive floor. Something serious was unfolding, and he wasn't just here to witness it. He was here to fix it. He made his way past the corridor that led to the administrative offices and stopped only when he reached a cordoned-off section near the boardroom. A guard stepped in front of him instinctively, hand out, about to speak, but caught sight of Elijah's hospital-issued badge. There was a flicker of confusion. Then a pause. Then compliance. No words exchanged. But the moment hung there. He entered the boardroom and saw it, a flurry of aides and executives circling the prone figure of Director Sam Whitaker. A thin blanket covered the man's chest. His face was pale, jaw tight, eyes shut. The chief physician stood nearby, barking orders, but none of it made sense. Elijah could hear it in the cadence, a diagnosis not yet formed, panic thinly veiled as confidence. Elijah took the tablet from his coat pocket and pulled up the director's medical records. He noted the recent lab results, an irregularity in hemoglobin levels, a minor note about visual distortions written off as stress. But there it was, a misalignment of vascular data in the left hemisphere that no one had flagged. It wasn't a stroke. It was a ruptured AVM. A rare one. Deadly if misread. Devastating if untreated for even another few minutes. He moved forward and cleared space around the director. Someone objected, not verbally but with body language. The kind that questioned authority without needing to ask. Elijah's face didn't change. He adjusted a monitor, repositioned the director's head, and began administering the treatment sequence that only one other hospital in the city had ever successfully performed under pressure. For 15 minutes, no one breathed. Until the monitor chirped, and the silence snapped. The director stabilized. And the room, a room full of people who hadn't even recognized Elijah as a doctor minutes ago, shifted its weight as if gravity had suddenly changed. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't look for validation. He handed off post-operative notes to the nurse and walked out as the paramedics arrived with a mobile rig to transfer the director to ICU. Outside, in the hallway, a different tension awaited him. A cluster of staff near the entrance to the cardiology wing stared. Some whispered. Others just watched. He kept walking. The hospital, massive and gleaming with its glass panels and marbled entrances, had always promised a culture of equality. But Elijah knew what it really was, a place where bias didn't yell, it assumed. It assumed he was the intern. It assumed he needed to be told where to stand. It assumed his presence needed explanation. That evening, after filing his incident report, Elijah sat alone in his car in the parking garage. The engine off. His fingers resting on the steering wheel. He thought about the director's eyes, glazed but flickering, in that final second before consciousness left him. There had been fear. But there had also been trust. Not born from rapport. Born from instinct. Elijah knew this wouldn't change everything. He would walk into another building tomorrow and face the same glances. The same doubt. But something had cracked. Not just in the room. In the system. And that was enough for now. Morning sun washed over the hospital's glass facade, turning its sterile edges into mirrors that blinded the incoming staff with light. Inside, the temperature was kept a constant 21 degrees Celsius, just enough to chill your skin but not enough to complain. That was how the place operated, polished, efficient, and cold in all the wrong ways. It was a structure designed for control, not comfort. And in that space, Elijah had learned to navigate like a shadow slipping between expectations. The news had spread by then. Director Whitaker was alive. Stable. Recovering. No one said Elijah's name in the morning briefing. There were no applause, no formal acknowledgments. Just a line item, successful stabilization of vascular event, as if the outcome had arrived on its own. But something unspoken lingered beneath the silence. The kind of reverence that only existed when people didn't yet know how to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they had believed. Elijah moved through the cardiology floor that day with a different weight on his shoulders. Not heavier, just sharper. He noticed the way people stepped aside faster, how their eyes held longer, how even seasoned nurses checked his expression before asking a question. He wasn't invisible anymore. But visibility came with its own price, expectation without grace. Later that afternoon, he was called into an emergency case on the trauma floor, a gunshot wound with unstable vitals. He scrubbed in, performed his role, and stabilized the patient with methodical precision. But when he stepped out of the operating room, still in blood-streaked scrubs, a hospital administrator approached him. The man didn't ask about the patient. He asked about the press. Apparently, a journalist had gotten wind of the Whitaker story. They wanted a name, a quote, a photo. Elijah declined. He didn't do it out of humility. He did it because he knew the pattern. They didn't want him, not really. They wanted the symbol. The anomaly. The "Look What We Let in the Room" headline. He wasn't going to be their exceptional black man for a news cycle. He wasn't going to be reduced to proof. So he went back to his office and buried himself in case files, quietly preparing for the week ahead while the hospital buzzed with speculation. His inbox filled with meeting requests. Department heads wanted to speak to him. Young interns wanted mentorship. A few former skeptics tried to mask their discomfort with praise, thin, strained compliments that clung to him like static. That evening, a nurse named Rachel stopped by his office. She had been there the day of the incident. She said nothing about the director. She just handed him a folded note, no name on it, just 3 neat lines. Saw what they didn't. Knew what they couldn't. Thank you for being unshakable. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't cry. He folded the note and placed it in the back of his desk drawer. He wouldn't frame it. He wouldn't forget it either. The next few days blurred into routine. Elijah worked night shifts, handled consults in neurology, covered for a colleague on leave. But underneath the schedule, something new grew, a quiet ripple among the staff. Young black nurses who held their shoulders straighter. A janitor who nodded a little deeper as Elijah passed. A med student who followed him silently through the halls, not asking for a mentorship, just witnessing him like a compass pointing true. Then, on Friday, it happened. The director asked to meet him. Whitaker had regained full cognitive function, though his voice remained weak. Elijah entered the recovery suite with his chart in hand, reading vitals, preparing to update treatment. But as he looked up, he saw it, the director's eyes locked on him, holding something more than recognition. They held humility. The kind that didn't apologize. The kind that listened. Whitaker gestured for a chair. Elijah sat. No one else spoke. It wasn't a meeting. It was a moment. One man acknowledging the other without needing to say the words. Outside that room, the hospital kept turning. The world didn't stop. But something inside its core had shifted. A man who didn't look like the image the system preferred had stepped in, done the impossible, and refused to cash in for validation. He had become undeniable. Not because of theatrics, because of excellence. And now, the place that tried to box him out had to redraw its blueprint around him. 2 weeks passed. The rhythms of the hospital returned to their usual tempo. Fast, efficient, indifferent. New emergencies arrived, old ones resolved. Another patient coded on the 7th floor. A child was prepped for cardiac surgery. A nurse filed a formal complaint about scheduling. Life moved on. But something in the foundation of that sterile institution no longer stood the same. Because word had gotten out. Not from the hospital. From the people. A medical student had quietly posted a thread online about what they had witnessed that day. A black physician stepping into a high-stakes boardroom emergency and saving the director's life while being treated as if he didn't belong. The post didn't mention Elijah by name, but it didn't have to. Those who knew the system understood who it had to be. And for those who didn't, the truth echoed loud enough between the lines. The thread went viral. Not because it was scandalous, because it was relatable. So many had been dismissed at doors they helped build. Told they didn't belong. That they didn't look the part. And here was proof that the part had always been a lie. Elijah didn't comment. He didn't repost it. But he felt it ripple through the halls like a silent thunderclap. More people began asking for him by name. Residents who had once avoided eye contact now came with questions. Younger staff started shadowing his rounds. The administrators, uncomfortable but intrigued, tried to find ways to formalize his presence. New panels, new protocols, suddenly curious about diversity optics and equitable leadership. But Elijah didn't take the bait. He didn't want their committees. He didn't want to be a face on a brochure. He wanted better systems. One afternoon, in the surgical review board meeting, Elijah presented a new workflow designed to catch early signs of cerebral anomalies, the kind of detail that could have saved lives long before the crash cart was needed. His method was clean, scalable, efficient. And more than that, it didn't require expensive new tech or extra staff. The board listened, some skeptically, but one by one they nodded. Change wasn't instant, but it had begun. Later that week, Elijah was invited to speak at a symposium downtown. The theme was Breaking Bias in Modern Medicine. He declined the main stage, instead opting to run a closed workshop for interns and first-year residents. In a small auditorium under dim lights, he walked them through not only diagnostics but resilience. Not through lectures, through real cases, real systems, real decisions. He didn't tell them to be exceptional. He showed them how to be consistent, and that was more powerful. One of the residents stayed behind after the session. She was quiet, South Asian, only a year into her rotation. She said she never thought someone like her could lead a room until she saw Elijah do it without raising his voice, without apologizing for his presence, without needing to prove anything. Elijah nodded, not because he needed her gratitude, but because he knew exactly what she meant. Back at the hospital, whispers turned to conversations. The chief of surgery approached Elijah in the hallway and asked to co-author a research paper. A nurse manager proposed creating an internal bias training series modeled after his interactions. HR asked him to sit in on a hiring panel. He declined politely, choosing instead to write a short document, a list of questions institutions should ask themselves before hiring anyone. Will they respect the invisible voices? Will they question what they're told? Will they listen, not just hear? Will they hold the door once they walk through it? He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The director had returned by then. Weaker, quieter, but more present. At a quarterly staff meeting, he stood briefly and addressed the team. He didn't name Elijah, but he acknowledged the person who had stood between his life and death, and in doing so named something far greater: the failure of a system to see past its own reflection. That night, Elijah walked the perimeter of the hospital alone. He watched the ambulances slide in and out of the emergency bay. He watched a father carry his sleeping child past the reception desk. He watched the building live, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a guest in it. He felt like its architect. The snow came early that year. By late November, the city was already blanketed in a cold, stubborn hush. Hospital windows, normally smudged with fingerprints and condensation, became pale filters for the gray sky beyond. Inside, heaters hummed steadily. People moved a little slower through the halls. Even emergencies seemed to carry a different tempo, like the whole building had adjusted its breath for the season. Elijah moved the same as always, quietly, deliberately, like a man who had learned that stillness wasn't weakness, but control. The hospital was changing, yes, but slowly, incrementally. Beneath the cosmetic shifts and new meetings about inclusion, the machinery of status remained, old assumptions rerouted rather than dismantled. Elijah saw it in glances exchanged between department heads, in whispered conversations at vending machines, in performance reviews that praised his composure instead of his clinical precision. But he wasn't surprised. He didn't expect revolution. He expected resistance. And he had prepared for it. Instead of fighting the narrative, he rewrote the framework. He built mentorship pockets within departments, not as official programs but as patterns. One by one, interns who had grown tired of pretending found his office after hours. They didn't come for speeches. They came because they knew he would listen. He met with them after shifts, walking with them through old case files, encouraging them to ask the questions they had learned to bury. Not just about medicine, about posture, about eye contact, about silence. About how to walk into a room where your authority is questioned before you speak. He gave them strategies. He gave them truth. But he never gave them anger. Anger was earned. It was a luxury too often mistaken for momentum. What he gave them was clarity. One night, a young black resident named Tyrone came to him after a consult. He had been reprimanded by a senior physician for assertiveness, a word that in this context meant audacity. Tyrone had made the correct call in triage, had saved a life, but had done so without asking permission first. Elijah walked him through the case, confirmed the call, then gave him one sentence to carry. Let your results speak even when they try to silence the tone. Tyrone left with his chin higher than it had arrived. Outside the hospital, the conversation had begun to expand. Local news had picked up on the online story. Profiles appeared in blogs and forums, anonymized but unmistakable. Patients began requesting the one who saved the director. Some said it outright. Others inquired in hushed tones. The hospital's PR department reached out again. They wanted to do a feature, a profile. This time, Elijah didn't ignore the email. He replied with one condition. Feature the patient, not me. The article came out a week later. It was about Director Whitaker's brush with death, the symptoms, the misdiagnosis, the near loss. Buried within the story, just past the fold, was a paragraph. A physician recognized what others missed. He saw the anomaly in the data, trusted instinct over assumption, and intervened within seconds of catastrophe. His name was Dr. Elijah Reed. No picture, no accolades, but the message had landed. After that, something odd began to happen. The older physicians, the ones who had once dismissed Elijah or questioned his credentials, began inviting him into smaller circles. Not performatively, quietly. They asked him to consult on complex cases, to review protocols, to mentor their juniors. He could have refused. He didn't. He understood that dignity didn't mean distance. It meant showing up with clarity in places that once tried to shrink you. One afternoon, as Elijah reviewed post-op scans on the 4th floor, he noticed a name on a clipboard, Dr. C. Ramsey, the same attending who once asked him to fetch water during his first year of residency, thinking he was transport staff. Ramsey had submitted Elijah's name for the Distinguished Physician Award, the same award Elijah had once been passed over for 3 consecutive years. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even tell anyone. He let the moment sit quietly in the rhythm of the day, like a broken clock finally ticking once. Outside, snow fell in sheets against the darkening sky. Inside, Elijah walked the halls like always, coatless, calm, unbothered. But now, no one mistook him for anyone else. The award came in a plain white envelope. No ceremony, no spotlight, just a folded letter slid quietly into Elijah's department mailbox. Inside, black serif font declared him the recipient of the Distinguished Clinical Excellence Award for the quarter. A nameplate would be mounted in the surgical wing, and his contributions noted in the upcoming newsletter. He placed the letter inside a drawer, closed it, and returned to work. The truth was, he hadn't done it for recognition. But something inside him shifted at that moment. Not pride, not triumph, but a quiet note of affirmation. Not because they had finally seen him, but because their silence could no longer hide what had been undeniable all along. The hospital had changed its shape around him. But now he was the one shaping it. In conference rooms, people deferred to his insight. In strategy meetings, his voice framed decisions. In the hallway, people didn't just nod, they leaned in. He had become the standard that others measured themselves by, not because he sought it, but because excellence held weight over time. And yet, despite the growing deference, Elijah remained exactly who he had been that first day. He wore the same quiet expressions. He kept his office Spartan and the lights low. He stayed after hours, not for praise but for peace. He understood that real impact wasn't about becoming visible. It was about becoming undeniable, even when unseen. One Thursday morning, a case file arrived from a partner hospital across town. A child with a complex AVM, similar to the director's condition. They were requesting a consult. Elijah accepted without hesitation. He read the scan for 2 hours before calling the attending. Not to explain the protocol, to ask about the child. Their story, their environment, their odds beyond the or. That was what others still missed. The patient wasn't a puzzle. They were a person. Back at the hospital, Elijah continued mentoring. He established a shadowing program not listed on the official HR paperwork. No sign-ups, no forms. Just a knock on his office door and a quiet welcome. He shared knowledge like oxygen, uncredited but vital. He built bridges without blueprints, knowing that legacy wasn't in titles but in the people you leave prepared behind you. And then, late one evening, something unexpected happened. Director Whitaker walked unannounced into Elijah's office. He no longer looked fragile. Age still weighed on his frame, but his presence had shifted. Humbled, rooted. In his hand was a manila folder. He placed it on Elijah's desk. Inside, a proposal, a new department, Equity in Emergency Medicine. A unit focused not on PR, but on protocol reform, chart audits, diagnostic bias reviews, multidisciplinary collaboration led by clinicians who had lived what most only studied. At the top of the page, Elijah's name, not as contributor, as founder. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the folder, then at the man who had once barely made eye contact in a hallway. There was no pride in the moment. There was something bigger, a mirror, not of Elijah's rise, of the institution's shift, slow, clumsy, but real. He accepted, quietly, on his own terms. Over the next few months, the department took shape. No flashy announcements, no magazine spreads, just a quiet hum of change. Cases reviewed with new frameworks, errors caught before harm, residents trained not just in treatment but in empathy. Some resisted, some resigned, but most adapted. Because the hospital no longer rewarded only performance. It began rewarding perspective. And that shift, slow as it was, became permanent. Elijah still walked the halls with his same quiet rhythm. Still wore simple clothes. Still kept his headphones looped casually around his neck. But now no one asked if he worked there. They asked how to join what he was building. And every now and then, when someone new, uncertain, underestimated, paused at the edge of a corridor, unsure whether to speak or turn back, Elijah would tilt his head, offer a nod, and gesture them forward. Not as permission, as recognition. Because he remembered what it felt like to carry brilliance beneath doubt. To walk through doors that weren't built for you. And to save lives in rooms where you weren't supposed to stand. Spring crept into the city quietly, softening its sharp edges with pale light and trembling warmth. Trees lining the hospital's perimeter bloomed cautiously, their branches laced with pinks and whites. The days grew longer, but inside the hospital, time still moved in pulses, heartbeats, alarms, the slow drip of IVs. Yet within those measured rhythms, something had fundamentally shifted. The new department had taken root. What started as a proposal, a single folder on Elijah's desk, had become a functioning model that challenged precedent. The Equity in Emergency Medicine unit didn't merely audit mistakes or rewrite language in manuals. It restructured how care was delivered. Diagnoses were cross-reviewed with cultural and racial bias indicators. Data dashboards included context, not just numbers. And more importantly, no assumption went unquestioned. Elijah worked without hierarchy, creating a team dynamic that flattened the traditional pyramid. Nurses, technicians, residents, physicians all had voice. All were heard. Rounds became collaborative think tanks. Morbidity and mortality reviews focused not on blame but on blind spots. The effect was undeniable. Patient outcomes improved. Referral errors dropped. And slowly, the hallway whispers of "that's just how it is" disappeared. But with recognition came resistance. A handful of senior doctors filed private concerns with administration. They claimed Elijah's approach undermined authority. That he created confusion in leadership structure. That medicine needed clarity, not conversation. The board reviewed the complaints, then dismissed them, because the results spoke louder than the resistance. Still, Elijah didn't celebrate. He knew systems didn't collapse from a single blow. They eroded slowly, under pressure, under presence, under proof. That was his strategy all along. Not a fight, a redefinition. Outside of hospital walls, invitations piled up. National conferences, thought leader panels, media interviews. Elijah ignored most of them. He sent younger colleagues in his place. He believed legacy wasn't built in spotlights but in shadows where change first begins. One weekend, during a staff retreat, a presentation was given about resilience in high-pressure care. The keynote speaker, a white-haired physician with decades in trauma care, opened his remarks with a story, a quiet, powerful retelling of a black doctor who had saved a hospital director, sparked a shift in culture, and redefined what leadership looked like. He never said Elijah's name, but the entire room turned to look at him. Elijah didn't flinch. He nodded once as if to say, "Yes, I was there," and then turned back to his notes. Months passed, then years, and still Elijah remained. Not as a hero, as an architect. He built programs, trained staff, sat in on the lowest level hiring rounds asking simple questions like, does this person listen more than they speak? Will they make others feel smaller just to feel tall? because he knew that healing wasn't just biological. It was systemic. It was cultural. And so he built quietly, until the building could no longer function without the foundation he had laid. One day, as he reviewed surgical data in his office, a knock came at the door. A young intern stepped in, clearly nervous, holding a clipboard too tightly. She had made an error in intake, minor, but enough to delay a patient's prep. She expected judgment. Instead, Elijah walked her through the timeline. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dismiss her fear. He showed her the fix. And at the end, he said just one thing: "You belong here. Now act like it." That sentence lived in her spine for the rest of her career. Years later, when she became chief resident, she told that story again and again. Not about the mistake, but about the moment someone turned the room toward her instead of away. Elijah's impact wasn't written on plaques or carved into awards. It was etched into people, into posture, into how they held their shoulders when walking into a boardroom, into how they answered when someone said they didn't look like they belonged. Because now they knew better. Because Elijah had once stood exactly where they stood, dismissed, underestimated, erased, and had become the standard. Not by demanding a seat at the table, by building a new table, and then pulling out chairs for everyone who came after.